Jivana, welcome.
Mm. Hey,
Thank you for joining me.
thanks for having me. It's so nice to see you.
Well, likewise, and thank you also for sending me this,
Ah,
the
yeah,
Teacher's Guide to Accessible Yoga.
yeah.
And
So glad it arrived.
yeah, it's been keeping me company all day. In fact, I've been
Ah,
also having a look back at some of your earlier writing, and you're going back to the beginning with accessible
ah,
yoga,
ah.
and seeing the journey you've been on in the last 10 years or so in the
Yeah.
writing and producing of books. And before we dive into the new book and talk a little bit about some of the evolution of what you've been presenting, I'd just like to ask if you could clarify for all of the people who are listening what accessible yoga actually means.
That's actually one of the hardest questions I get, actually. It's funny because I think it depends on context a little bit, I mean, it's definitely a phrase that I came up with to define something that I was trying to share with the world, which was
Hmm,
trying to trying to show that we could make these teachings available to everyone. And I have a background in AIDS activism,
hmm.
uh, and that really, through that work, my AIDS activism, I really became more conscious of ableism, and I started to see, I guess it was in the '90s when I started teaching. I think that's when it was so clear that yoga was kind of turning to something else, and I was just really concerned. And so, accessible yoga was just an effort to reframe or kind of state that yoga can be available to everyone.
And
Um,
just to clarify, ableism meaning, sort of bias towards people who are physically capable of doing all sorts of manipulations of their body parts.
yeah. And interesting, the other part of ableism that I think is really important in the yoga world is part of ableism is the idea that disabled people need to be fixed or changed.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of a core element of contemporary practice, this idea of, fixing us and turning us into some kind of something else, right? Like
Yeah.
becoming something else. Yeah. So that's it. But the other thing about accessible yoga, I would just say, is that to me, I'm really, as you know, I'm very interested in practicing yoga, like being a practitioner, and the spiritual aspects actually are what really draw me, and philosophy as well. And I feel like people think of accessible yoga mostly as how to adapt asana, and that's a big
Yes.
part of what I do. But I just want to say I think there's more to it than that. That to me it's about finding a way to help people get access to some of those deeper aspects of yoga.
Oh, thank you for clarifying all of that. And that line really about, not fixing people really stood out to me. If I remember rightly, it was an excerpt you just ran in Yoga Journal from the book, which focused on that, the whole sort
Mm.
of challenge as a teacher of, I guess, being confronted with people who seem like they've got things that you can do something with, and to be okay with just letting them be who they are rather than assuming that in the first place what's wrong in inverted commas with them, and let alone that you can put it in inverted commas again right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it feels like yoga can be used, for kind of whatever purpose we want. I mean, we tend to, and I do that too. I'll take responsibility for what I'm doing too, which is kind of framing it for to fit into my worldview. And
Hmm.
I think that's happened quite a lot, in contemporary practice, that it kind of goes along with this idea of, I don't know, like in the wellness world, that we're trying to fix and become something, that if we have the right clothing and if we're on the right beach or something, then we'll be happy. This idea of attaining something that's really kind of a marketing ploy, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, no one ever failed to get rich by promising other people that they would get in some way enriched.
exactly. Right. And so I think there's been such an impact on yoga from that, and literally from marketing, conscious, well, maybe not conscious, like, but from marketing people working for like clothing companies and wellness brands that are showing us that you can get something that you don't have if you change. And I don't think that's what yoga is necessarily about. I mean, yoga is definitely about evolving, but maybe it's, or devolving, connecting back to something that we have within us. And I feel like that's really the core teaching that's lost, this idea that we already have it, we're fine, like part of us is unchanged and unaffected by anything. And that's what I love about yoga, this kind of focus on the, I hate to say focus on the positive, but this idea that we're okay, and I think that my new book is an effort to help support yoga teachers in reframing their work a little bit, away from that.
Well, one of the ways in which you reframe your own role, which really stood out for me, yeah, it was very powerful, in fact, so much that I wrote it down. It's a line about, in the context of spiritual bypass, you're talking about, the fact that actually it's important as a yoga teacher to really acknowledge that we might be struggling. And in fact, you say yoga teachers are often people who are struggling with life, but doing it in a conscious way. And so stopping
Yeah,
any
aren't we?
pretense of being, we've got it all under control, and actually admitting, we're in this mess together, and what we're trying to do is make peace with our situation as far as we can. Coming back to the old serenity prayer, changing what we can
Mm,
do something about, while also, making our peace with what we can't. So I was
yeah.
curious to hear how that shows up for you as, a teacher of accessible yoga. What way do you feel that you're struggling with life?
Wow. Well, I mean, first, I just want to agree that it seems like I don't want to say the yoga teachers are maybe the messiest people I know, but it's not far from that, to be honest. I mean, I'm surrounded by them. I love yoga teachers dearly, but part of it is just that we're so messy, and I include myself, like we're just human. I think what it is that makes someone a yoga, maybe not even a yoga teacher, but a yoga practitioner is an awareness of that, just an awareness that there's something not right. Maybe it's suffering, that we're suffering in a more conscious way. And we think, oh, I want to do something about that. Like you said, change what we can change. For myself, I mean, yeah, I've had so many struggles and challenges. I mean, it's endless. I don't think we want to go into that. I'm happy to share, but it's like, this could be therapy. I'm happy to talk about,
Mm.
I remember one moment, um, turning 50, and my mom died that same year, and it was just like, I don't know, I just felt completely lost and overwhelmed. And it's like my body started having physical problems, and I was in grief from her death, and it was like I had anxiety and all these problems started happening. And I was like, wait, how could this be happening to me? I've been practicing very earnestly for like 30 years, and here I am, like a total disaster. And then I just realized, I'm human. That's just the nature of humanity. It's like yoga is not going to change that, right? It's about accepting that part of myself. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And I think that is, really in itself a very accessible message, because there's probably nobody out there who can't relate to the idea of, being in some kind of, you know, panic-stricken moment. We all
Yeah.
go through that, and yoga is not a way. In fact, that's a really harmful use of yoga, to try and hide from feeling. I mean, I've done that myself in all sorts of ways. Originally
Yeah.
through all sorts of really self-destructive methods that I used yoga to try and let go of. But then I used yoga to do that also. So it's definitely
Yeah.
more welcome to admit to the fact that we struggle.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what it is to be human. And I don't think yoga is about denying humanity, but connecting with another part of ourselves. And I just, I
Mm.
love that idea that we can accept our differences, our frailty, and that's okay. That doesn't need to be fixed or changed. Yoga is about something else, right? Connecting to, like I said, to this other part of ourselves. That's okay. And I think that gets confused, you know. You know what I'm saying? That it's like we confuse this idea of fixing rather to just reconnecting. And I think that's a different framework for the
Well,
work.
it's a difference between coming home and having to go on a long journey to some
Ah,
unknown destination way over the hill.
yeah, exactly. There you go. That's beautiful. Yeah.
So
It's just
I'm
coming
also,
home.
yeah.
Hmm. I
Curious
love
then,
it.
as presenting this to teachers, what it was that was inspiring you to kind of start again, go back to the drawing board, having already written a book really generally about this practice of accessible yoga, feeling the urge to come back with a specifically teacher-oriented guide to how to present things to make that more accessible.
Yeah. I think it was just it's what I do all day. I train yoga teachers. And so
Hmm.
it occurred to me that I could reach more yoga teachers that way, and that there's a message that I have for yoga teachers that's slightly different than the general public. I mean, it's still similar. It's still accessible yoga. It's still about, yeah, the way I perceive these teachings, but I just think yoga teachers are so important in this process, right? Like they're the ones, they're like at the front lines of making this impact in the world. And I feel like they can cause so much damage. They can do so much wrong.
Yeah.
And have, we all have. I have too. I mean, there's been so much abuse and terrible things
Mm.
on behalf of yoga teachers. And I think, and yet I know so many that are incredible. I mean, I really know so many amazing yoga teachers. So I just think we need to be a little more ethical, actually, is really maybe the core of what I'm thinking about. Like, how can we really embody yoga's ethics when we're
Mhm.
teaching and really value, maybe not value, but really understand the importance of what we're doing, really that there's so much power in our position. And I think that we need to wield that power more consciously. And that's why I wrote the book, to try to just support teachers in bringing a more conscious, ethical approach to what they're doing.
One of the pillars, when you were describing what accessible yoga is at the beginning of the book, is community. And I was curious as to how that might, play into the question of accountability, given that, perhaps traditional lineage structures haven't
Yeah.
shown their capacity to hold gurus to account. And also, the modern capitalist yoga jungle hasn't necessarily developed its own muscles in that direction either.
Yeah, right. I do think community is the key. I don't know, I don't know the exact process, but I feel like that's the only way. I think I quote Thich Nhat Hanh, he says, the
Hmm.
next Buddha is a Sangha. It's like that's the only way forward is through connection. And that's part of this book, why I wrote this book too, is to have a conversation actually. Like I mean, I say a lot in there, but I also know that, people will disagree with me, and there's a lot more to say. And I'm open to that. Like, I'd like to hear from other teachers. But going back to what you're asking, I think first it starts with us just recognizing that we're human and we're going to mess up. And then we
Hmm.
recognize, oh, wait, I do need some support to help me with that. Like you said, it's probably not going to be a guru or a teacher these days, but it could be my other yoga teacher friends, right? It could be a community that I build of people, of peer support, just people that I talk to when I need help. And it
Yeah.
happens all the time. So actually, one thing I do in the book is I share at the end of each chapter like a scenario, which is something that's actually happened to me, and where I've really struggled and not known what to do. And then I kind of give what my answer would be now. Um, but I just know at the time, so often I would have to go to my yoga teacher friends and ask them, like, what do you think? And that's just been, it's been so valuable for me to have that over the years. Other yoga teachers that, I mean, I might look up to them, but they're not necessarily my teachers. They're people that I maybe even learn from sometimes, but also practice along with, or just have some kind of, yeah, peer relationship with. I don't see any other way. Yeah.
No, I hear you. And I guess the other question though is, out there again in the sort of wild west of yoga, we've not really got community groups a lot of the time because everybody's, out in this very competitive, everyone for himself, striving to make ends meet. There's not even in the way that there was 20 years ago, sort of established yoga schools. And yet you've built a yoga schools. Kind of curious as to how you found that process, sort of almost swimming against the tide in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about that actually. I think the accessible yoga community is actually quite small. We have kind of a
Mm.
very tight knit circle of people who I know that I've trained or that have trained with people I've trained. And I feel like, or other teachers, great teachers like Matthew Sanford, for example, is just such a pioneer. Anyway, I mean, there's a community. We used to meet, we'd have conferences
Mm.
before COVID. Well, during COVID, we did it online, but in person, those were really special in terms of building community. That's that in-person connection is quite powerful. But I've been thinking about, how do I reach this broader audience and what does that mean? And I feel like
Mm.
I'm definitely in my comfort zone when I work within my community. Like, they support me, and so like it's been interesting in the process of marketing this book, which has just come out. It's like, who am I talking to exactly? You know, am I just talking to my peers, basically, and to the people who already agree with me? Can I reach out kind of to the other part of that yoga? Yeah, I love what you're calling it, jungle and the Wild West. I mean, it really is, you know. Actually, you know how I do those? I do these reels where I remix some kind of intense
Mm.
asana thing. That has been a real eye-opening experience for me, working like just tagging or messaging these teachers who I never would connect with otherwise. And their response has been amazingly positive, actually. Like, I think most
Oh.
people really need that connection or want it. They just don't know how. Yeah.
Just to clarify for those who aren't extremely online,
Yes.
Jivana takes videos that people make on Instagram of themselves doing, fancy show-off contortion type yoga, and demonstrates how by sitting in a chair or some other, very static approach, you can actually achieve a very similar result from the point of view of, just tuning into the body. And they're quite sort of tongue-in-cheek and at the same time, quite serious. And it's nice that people come with the sort of seriousness, understanding the tongue-in-cheekness, and want to engage rather than feeling
Yeah.
insulted or talked down to.
Yeah, I was worried at first, but like the reaction is almost always positive by them. Usually I would ask them first.
Mm.
And always they're like, yeah, I love making yoga accessible. They often, these people, and I'm saying these people, and that's othering them already, but you know, they're doing this intense practice, and yet they would say, yeah, I'm interested in making yoga accessible. So I think they have this ideal, like they want it, but maybe don't know how. And I think also it's about connecting, just connecting to anyone, being open to building community. I think most of us do want that in yoga. And there has been a failure, I think, of I'll say the structures that we have, like the default structures, say like of Yoga Alliance or groups like that, that really have been ineffective at supporting community building in yoga. And like you said, the guru lineage and all that has also been ineffective. I mean, there's benefit to it, but I think it barely exists anymore. So it's like, what is left? You know, I think, to be honest, what's left for me is that individual teachers who are working within their communities and building that on kind of a small level. And that's another reason I wrote the book, is to support those teachers, because I think they are doing the work. Like, you know, people who teach in their little town and they have a group of students who are dedicated to them, and they're dedicated to their students. And that's the community of yoga, I think.
And I also appreciate, though, that you have reached out in the writing of the book, well beyond, let's say, your comfort zone, even, because you spoke to a few people whose
Yeah,
quotes you include in the book, who would
yeah,
very much not almost identify themselves, at least, as accessible yoga
yeah,
practitioners, or be identified by those who practice with them with that label. I'm thinking particularly of Jason Crandall and Kino McGregor,
yeah.
known as strong vinyasa-based teachers of, very sort of serious asana-focused yoga, although they've got much else to offer as well. I'm
Mm.
wondering how both of those conversations came about, and why
Uh,
you chose to end the book with Kino. I
yeah,
was very surprised when I got there, and she's in the epilogue, sort of framing the whole conclusion.
yeah. I think you already got it. I mean, I think it's just what you said. I felt, I don't know, like through this last couple of years, as I've been reaching out, kind of, I keep wanting to say across the aisle, because I think about American politics, you know, how we're just so divided here. And I think
It
it's
is
kind of
so
true.
polarized. Mm.
Yeah. And I think that's just the nature of our US culture and society right now. There's so much separation. And so that's part of my interest, is like reaching out within the yoga community, which you think it would be easy to do. But yeah, um, I actually had, Kino was the first person I made one of those mixed reels with, and she was so
Mm.
open to it. And we've actually kind of made a friendship over the years, through a few little things. She's quite surprising. I don't know if you know her, but she
I've
puts
only
out,
ever emailed her, but yeah, so I've
okay,
never
yeah, she
actually
puts out a
spoken.
very, yeah, like it's a very strange image of this very intense physical practice, but she's a very dedicated practitioner, really understands the heart of yoga, I think, really, really well. And is just so dedicated to yoga. I mean, I really admire that about her. And actually, she has a new book coming out that's called Accessible Ashtanga.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is kind of funny to me. But anyway, I think she's also been a great supporter of my work, and I appreciate that. Jason Crandall, I don't really know him, but I appreciate him. Like from what I've read of him and studied, just of what he shares in the world, it always feels pretty clear. And I think he's well-meaning. And so I guess I was trying to find people that I could, yeah, find some connection with, even though we're not exactly the same, we're dedicated to yoga teachers mostly and to teaching yoga. And like Judith Lassiter, who I think of as like, you know, the old school, like she's really like started that. Like she did so much, she was the first person that I know who created a code of ethics for yoga teachers when she ran the California Yoga Teachers Association way back when, basically created a yoga journal. I don't know, like she's pretty incredible. So I don't
I
know. I
guess
just
she
thought
saw plenty in that Iyengar world of the
oh God, yeah.
70s and 80s to give her the shivers.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many more, so many other people, but I just thought, I don't know, I wanted to make a small step outward from my comfort zone. And it was fun. I'm sharing those conversations in a podcast too. So those will come out eventually. You can actually hear the full conversations I had with them if people are interested. The ones with Jason and Kino are really interesting for sure. I don't agree with everything they said, but that's okay. The other thing I was thinking about you today, actually, you know how it seems like in the past in yoga, there was this debate, like a what do you call it? There was a different way of approaching talking about the teachings and sharing them, which was more in a debate style, right? Where you didn't have to agree with someone. You'd actually just have a conversation, and the public debates were often how it was done, right? Am I right about that?
Yeah, and violent disagreements in some
Violent.
cases as well. I mean, really, there's utter disdain for other philosophical perspectives, despite, an enormous overlap between the various different worldviews that, sort of broadly speaking, have framed yoga over the centuries. Yeah.
But that seems missing to me, like the exchange. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The exchange of ideas. And so I kind of wanted to do that. And actually, with Kino, I pulled out the piece that I agreed with from her, the conversation I had with her. And that's why I closed the book with that, just to show like I love this idea. She talked about herself as a student, that she's
Yeah.
always a student. And I think that's so important because people see her as like this perfect yoga, whatever. And I love that I really saw she was very dedicated to that idea of her, that I'm a student first. And I love that as a teacher. I think that's why I want to end the book with this idea of still being a student. That's maybe the most important message, for me.
Well, absolutely. And in the same spirit, if we're not asking questions, if we're not continuing to inquire, if we think we got all the answers already, we've kind of given up on the whole point of practice because, every answer is provisional. It's in this moment, and the search continues as long as we're alive. And it's not really like we're going to find anything other than, what we've got right here, but we've got to keep looking at it. Otherwise, we
Yeah,
drift off into la la land again. Yeah.
right. I mean, I think that's been that's been important for me because I trained through a lineage through integral yoga, and
Mhm.
I was definitely in the guru tradition, and I believed everything that I was told 100%. And when I saw other traditions, I thought, oh, that's wrong. And it took me a long time to let go of that and to start to appreciate the diversity within yoga, even and different perspectives on these same teachings, which is so, so important.
Well, absolutely. And I think within a lot of these traditions, I spent a lot of time in the Iyengar world initially. There was utter disdain, really, for most other approaches to asana practice.
Yeah.
And, it is quite similar to the ancient tradition of basically absolutely savage your rivals by calling them ignorant and, adherents of a completely different tradition, completely rejecting everything they say.
Yeah.
And, that's not very helpful, obviously, because no tradition's got a monopoly on really anything other than its own approach. And in the end, there are many different ways to a similar objective. So there's this validity to dabbling a little bit and seeing from a different, viewpoint, because it helps us to see through some of these things that we're told that aren't necessarily true about the worldview that we've been presented, or
Yeah.
even, the way that the philosophy relates to the practices, which in many cases have been, put together in much more recent times than the texts that are being used to rationalize them.
Yeah. That is always funny to me. It does seem like it's something I love about yoga, and that's so challenging is just that it's such a mishmash. It's just like it's It's like a patchwork.
Masala. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. And I think, it's okay to embrace that too. Like, I know only what I know. I mean, I only know the things I've studied, the people I studied with, and I know there's totally different ways of approaching the same ideas. But that's why I
And the
go back.
more we've
Yeah, what?
go ahead, sorry, no.
I was gonna say that's why I go back to being a practitioner, and I say, well, I'm not an academic because I don't. It's kind of like giving myself a break or an out, which is like for me, it's just about my practice and trying to understand it through my personal experience. Yeah.
Well, that's very important, and I'm always being hauled up on social media by people who want to say what's all this sort of academic kind of
Yeah.
deconstruction of things. What does that contribute? How's anybody going to get anywhere in their life listening to you, basically? And I sort of try to say, well, I found it really helpful to break down some of the things I've been told that turned out not to be very true, and
Yeah.
I'd like to help others to just look outside their little sort of prism, and to see through a slightly different refraction of things, because it's never the whole truth. It's just a way of seeing, and to look at some of these old texts with fresh eyes rather than the preconceptions he brought to them, and to try to perhaps see how we can continue to embody some of the spirit of these ideas through new approaches. In a way, that's what you're talking about with accessible yoga, going back to the Upanishads, but on a chair with some props.
Yeah,
uh,
exactly. I know. I
so I
know.
just wanted to go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
No, I know you're going to ask me a good question. Please go ahead. I can feel it coming.
Well, I wanted to just first of all pick up on the the podcast I mentioned. I went looking to see if any of those episodes were out there, and I discovered the interviews that accompanied your previous book, Yoga Revolution. So I listened this afternoon to you talking to your editor at Shambhala, Beth Frankel, about the
Okay.
whole difficult task of putting together a
Yeah.
book. And I wanted to ask you about your decision with this book to publish it yourself, because
Yeah.
obviously having a publisher behind you does have some big advantages, but it also has some drawbacks. And
Yeah.
I imagine self-publishing works the same way, but with slightly different pros and cons. So I was curious if you could say a little bit more about the
Yeah.
decision and also those issues.
Well, also, I just want to thank you because Yoga Revolution, my second book, you helped me with that a lot. You helped review it, which I really appreciate. Your perspective was really invaluable. So I hope that you know that.
Well,
Um,
thank you. You're welcome.
yeah, I mean, I Beth has become a good friend through the process of publishing my first two books through Shambhala, and I learned a lot. I learned not as much as I thought I had learned, but I learned a lot about publishing through that. But
Yeah.
so I thought self-publishing seemed like a good idea. She encouraged me to do it. I don't think Shambhala wanted the book at all anyway. They didn't want this book. They said, well, it's very niche, just to write a book just for yoga teachers is kind of too small, an audience for them. They do kind of these broad, mostly Buddhist books and yoga books. And they'd be incredibly supportive of me, and I appreciate them. But and then I went to some other publishers actually with this book. I got turned down by another really big one, but then one pretty good one, I won't name them, but they wanted it. But at
Mhm.
that point, I realized, I think I'm willing to do it myself. The difference with self-publishing, to be perfectly honest, is that it's financial
Mhm.
because you have to make an investment up front. There's costs up front to publishing a book that if you go with a publisher, it's the opposite. So
Yeah,
let me put
ideally,
it this
they
way.
pay you a bit, don't they?
Yeah. And I got really great advances on my first two books with Shambhala, which I really appreciate. So they're giving you this money up front. They're handling all the upfront costs. And then they give you a very small royalty over time that you kind of use to pay back that advance. And like I'm finally actually getting advances on my first book, Accessible Yoga. Now I think it's been 5 years or so since I published it, but it took almost 5 years to start getting royalties on that book because of the advance and having to pay it back. And it sold really well. So it's a financial decision. With self-publishing, you put money out up front, and then if it sells well, potentially you get more royalties in the long run. So it's kind of almost like a financial decision. And I think it also depends on you, like what your position is in the world in terms of like, do you feel like you have a way of selling the book yourself? Or do you need the support of a publisher? Even though, as I say that, I just want to admit that publishers really depend on you to sell the book, right? They're not
Well, that
really.
was the interesting thing in that conversation. You get to the end of it and you're basically saying, well, the thing I learned was I got to do all the work.
Yeah, that's kind of why I did it myself in the end too. It's like I
Yeah.
appreciate them, but at this point I've realized I was selling it anyway.
Mm.
So I might as well make more money off it. Again, I had to invest up front, but I also had more control because when you go with a publisher, generally they control the cover and the title, which are
Yep.
big, right? And with self-publishing, I got to control it all, which made it really hard. It was hard to make decisions, it's like all on me. But I have a great team, a lot of support, so it worked out fine. I mean, it's just, it's been a journey. It still is. So it's still a journey. I made an audiobook for this new one, and
Ah.
but it's coming soon. So it's like, yeah, it's just complicated.
And you, I think, worked on the project through Amazon's self-publishing system, and you went on
Well,
your website into the sort of issues that exist, obviously, with Amazon. But
yeah. Well, that's what I it's actually two platforms.
ah,
Amazon first because they're biggest. So they have something called KDP, which is, I believe, called Kindle Direct Publishing. And
correct.
Amazon's horrific, but they control the market. And for self-publishers, like we don't really have a choice. Like if you want to sell
Mm.
your book, you kind of have to go through them. And it's interesting because they take a higher percentage, of course, being Amazon. They take basically, I think it's 40% plus a printing fee. And
Wow.
then there's this other Ingram Spark, which is
Yeah.
another very large platform that's not Amazon, that I believe is like Barnes and Noble and Target, things like that. And that's just been much slower. Like it just takes time. It's not as, Amazon's on it. They got it out right away. This one is like, I'm still waiting for it to be distributed. It's in a few places. My goal is for it to be available everywhere. I mean, that's what I
Yeah.
figured. So yeah, it's definitely been a learning process. Yeah. What about you? Are you going to do it? Are you going to self-publish? Is that?
I don't know. I'm weighing this up. I mean, I'm working on another book, but it's still very early days, and it's a struggle to interest people in yoga books. I had a chat with an agent last year. In fact, that's why I haven't got much further with my project because she was, enthusiastic on one level. I mean, I've written two books. I used to be, a regular journalist. I've got, a reasonable following of people, but she also then ran the slide rule across it and said, "What? Oh, you haven't got 50,000 followers?" And I was
Yeah.
like, "Well, no. So don't tick that box. You're not a celebrity. You haven't got any celebrities in your book. Okay, don't tick that box. And you want to write about yoga? Aren't there lots of books on yoga already?" So it's a challenge, and it's a challenge for people to make money selling yoga books, I guess. So that's they tend to see particular issues that are alive at the moment that they can align yoga with, or particular demographics that they can target, or political messages around other issues that can be brought together with yoga. And
Yeah.
those are the things that are safe bets for a marketing department at a publisher. And it does seem that it's the marketing department that makes a lot of the decisions. They don't necessarily do a lot of marketing, but they certainly think about what's going to sell.
That is true. I actually think publishers are marketing departments. I mean, there's no difference. That's all. They're businesses. Most of them are simply businesses owned by some person who is just trying to make a living, and they're making money off
Yeah,
your book, basically. So you
exactly.
have to
Yeah.
you have to realize that that's what's happening. And if you self-publish, then you have the potential of making money off your book, which is better, even though Amazon will still take a big chunk, or whoever's selling it. But yeah, I mean, generally, I think you're in a kind of similar situation I'm in. I think you could do it yourself, actually. I would recommend that you do. And I'm happy to help you. We can talk another time if you want.
Well, thank you. No, that would be
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
But I would say for most people who are kind of newer, if they're really just haven't written a book yet, I wouldn't necessarily start self-publishing. If you can get a publisher interested, I think it's worth doing one book through a publisher at least to kind of learn that process and have your hand held a little through it. And maybe, it gives you a sense of, I don't know, I got a book out, but like, I think if you are going to really pursue book writing, which I know you are, I mean, it's just part of who you are, then I think it's worth doing. And me too, I love writing, it's just such an important practice it's a practice for me.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things to do. So, um, I have a background in journalism, but it's nothing like yours, which is really incredible. I don't know if your listeners even know about your background.
I don't talk
You
about it
admitted
so
to it?
much, but yeah, yeah, no, I mean, I've touched on it, but I mean, it wasn't that
Wow,
stellar. But I
I
was
don't know.
a foreign correspondent for a few years, and worked at one point for the New York Times, and then
Ah,
saw them doing all sorts of heinous things. So
yeah.
quit in a hurry. Hmm.
But still, to get to the New York Times is pretty incredible. I mean, I wrote for a small AIDS newsletter. That was my journalism.
Probably have more integrity, Jivana.
No, it's just I had a really good editor actually who gave me such a hard time for years that it just made me really take writing seriously. So that's all. I think a lot of yoga teachers don't have that benefit of just any writing experience, and it's such a challenge and a skill I think that you have to develop over time. Um, that I'm still developing. I mean, it's like constantly changing, but that's why I appreciate your books and your work. I only know you have one book of yours, but
Well, the other one's a darker story. It's literally called A
yeah.
Rough Guide to the Dark Side, and it's all about
Okay.
quitting my job at the New York Times to get involved with Balkan gangsters. So it's not necessarily
Wow.
yoga friendly, but it is what led me to get serious about yoga. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. That's good. Yeah, I mean, and it's AIDS activism that got me involved. Same. I mean, it's kind of good to tell your story.
I think
That's
so.
the other thing I have to admit about not having a publisher is just feeling more free, like feeling freer just with my writing. I think when I was working for them, it was working for them. You know, like there was a certain, even though they were very supportive of me, I feel like I had to write something they wanted, you
Mhm.
know, and I got some direction from them that was a little bit specific, you know, like what they wanted me to produce. And I now feel like, oh, I can write it whatever I want. Like, I don't have to please anyone. Like I just whatever I feel is necessary and useful to the world can come. And that's an amazing feeling, you know.
No, exactly. And there is this possibility now that people haven't had until the modern
Yeah.
era to just have complete control of the means of production, so to speak. But
Oh yeah. And you know, a big part of it, I don't know if you're aware of this, is print on demand
yeah.
quality. So in the past, print on demand, which is what self-publishing generally is very poor quality. And so that you really could tell on a printed book that it was, you know, self-published. It just didn't have the same feeling. But now it's changed. And most publishers actually do print on demand
Exactly.
also.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
really there's almost no difference, maybe a tiny difference, but almost no difference between a big publishing house producing it and you doing it yourself. I mean, you can barely tell the difference looking at the book. You have to know what you're looking for, I think, to tell the difference now. Did you
I
tell in the
agree.
copy you got?
Well,
Um,
there's one striking thing on the back cover. There's no price, which you would always
yeah,
have on a normal book, but I guess you've got this set up for all markets, so there's no
yeah,
point sticking a price on the back.
yeah.
But yeah, I
But the
think the other
quality
thing,
is
I mean, I did.
better.
It's a very nice cover. In fact, I just got some new copies of my book, and they've obviously changed the printer they're using, and the cover's no longer got quite that same slightly
Yeah,
sticky matte finish, which is very nice. Makes you want to stroke it.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, yeah. But I think, yeah, coming back to what I said, I was a little bit over enthusiastic, perhaps to say complete control over the means of production, given what you were saying about how much of a slice Amazon takes out of it, and yeah, the fact that there is no perfect solution. And I think that brings me back to this question of accessibility in yoga. And I was
Mm.
really struck by something you wrote that it isn't actually possible to have 100% accessibility by any criterion, whether it's financial accessibility, whether it's accessibility of yoga spaces, the availability of practice to whoever might show up. There's always some compromise involved somewhere. And yet at the same time, there's a slogan I've seen you use a few times that says, if it's not accessible, it's not yoga. And I,
Yeah,
I wonder, I wonder how that statement, can be reconciled with the previous one.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that statement might be overstating things, but I think I'm trying to share a message. So first of all, I agree with what you're saying. It's hard to have 100% accessibility because one of the reasons is that we don't know what's happening inside of people and how they're responding. So you don't know if someone has had some kind of trauma and they react to something you say really negatively and it triggers them in some way, or because people might have conflicting needs in a space. This very common experience I've had teaching yoga where someone wants the room warm and someone wants it cold. And, you know, it's just like, it's impossible to please everyone, but not just please them, it's impossible to actually give them exactly what they need. We can do our best. And I guess the point is to kind of let us off the hook a little bit as yoga teachers, that it's more of a goal, an orientation to work on serving your students to the best of your ability. The phrase I use about if it's not accessible, it's not yoga, I'm trying to speak more to yoga philosophy, to what I see as kind of some of the underlying themes as I understand them in yoga, in the yoga teachings, which is that, I mean, all the texts that I've ever read seem to offer universal spiritual teachings, right? Saying that kind of that we share the same spiritual essence. It seems like there's this theme within yoga. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but like that there's this basic essence that we have, Atman or Purusha. And the point I try to make is if we're not allowing everyone a way to experience that, we're not representing that concept in yoga, this universal spiritual teaching. What do you think
Well,
of
I
that?
would agree with that in principle. Certainly, I mean, yeah, there are caveats. Samkhya philosophy, the dualistic system that the Yoga Sutra is built on, says there's many Purushas rather than there being one, so they might be
But they're
technically,
equal, aren't they?
functionally the same, yeah, but they're still
They're
sort of separate. So there's a slightly different spin on it, but functionally it's the same thing. And yet at the same time, I think the other thing I feel moved to say is the bar is then very high, Jivana. How do you teach everybody to access the Atman?
Yeah. I mean, that is really what we're doing, I think. I mean, if I often ask that question of people that I'm training, is like, what are you doing? Like, what do you think you're doing when you're teaching yoga? What is the point of standing up in front of a room or sitting in front of a room and like having people do all these things? Like, what is the actual goal here? And I'm not sure I can say what the goal is for everyone. I mean, for me, it is actually trying to give people some access to that part of themselves, because that's what I'm practicing for. My practice is to give voice to that. I guess I don't think of it as Atman when I say it out loud, but to me, that part of me that I know that is beyond just this body and mind, right? There's part of me that I can connect with. And I feel that is what I'm trying to do when I teach, is give people access to that as well through whatever practices might work for them. I don't know.
Well, in some ways, it makes a lot of sense to strip the, kind of fixation on doing things with the body out of it a little bit, because that's an enormous distraction. It's very easy to get hung up on what the body can and can't do, and
Oh yeah.
that can become its own rationale for practicing, and also the yardstick by which one sort of measures progress, rather than seeing it purely as, I mean, again, you quoted Kino at the end, sort of saying it's a tool, but I don't know that many people who use a very strong asana practice like Ashtanga to really actually see beyond the body. Often they say they're doing that while getting ever more attached to mastering the next posture in the sequence, until
Yeah.
they reach their limit when they're like, I can't go any further, or
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
get injured. And that's usually the point at which realism kicks in.
Right. But that's
Uh,
also where I enter the picture. You know what I'm saying? Like
mm,
my experience has been with people who have that, who I started teaching with disabled students. That's where it began for me. And so,
yeah.
my I started teaching yoga because I wanted to share with my community of people with HIV and AIDS. And this was in the 90s, and many people were still dying of AIDS. And so literally my first classes, I had students who were very sick and then were dying. And so I guess to me, I just immediately realized it's not about the body. It's just not about making the body better. I mean, that's a side benefit and it's important, right? Like there are potential health benefits to yoga that are great, but that's not what I don't see that in the teachings. When I read anything, the Gita, the sutras, Upanishads, it feels like there's a very clear theme of going beyond the body, right? To connect with some eternal spirit. I mean, it seems very clear to me, and I don't know why we're not saying that. I mean, I don't know. It's funny because I'm teaching a class about a workshop about faith later today, and I'm
Mm.
about a lot because I think faith is a word that is often used in religious context, but I actually think in the yoga context, why can't we have faith? Faith in ourselves, in that part of
Mm.
ourselves. And isn't that what we're doing? Is try to build that connection more strongly. identifying who we are, and then getting access to it.
Absolutely, yeah. It says in the commentary on Yoga Sutra 120 that's attributed to Vyasa, it sustains the yogi like a loving mother, Shraddha, the
Ah,
faith.
Shraddha.
So
Yes, right, right. And then it's 121 where it's Ishvara Pranidhana, right? I mean, that's where he's
a little
talking
bit
about.
further on, 23. Yeah, but
Yeah,
it's
23. Yeah.
right before we get into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And what is right? What is Patanjali actually talking about? I mean, Ishvara Pranidhana, it's so interesting to me the way contemporary scholars translate Ishvara Pranidhana, because I see so much conflict. There's so much confusion there for me. And I think it's because we're using a rational approach to something that's spiritual. To me, it's faith. It's this like connection to something beyond, and that's how it feels to me, at least. And I'm like, why can't we just say that? So like, could we reclaim the word faith? Is there a way to do that?
I think that's a very healthy attitude. In fact, I'm about to have a conversation with somebody who's shied away from using the word faith to translate that in a book
Uh-huh.
about a completely different topic. But it's an interesting question, I think, because there is a lot of, I guess, stigma around that word in the sense that it has this, I guess, monotheistic, organized religion connotation in the Western world. And yoga's not a religion in that sense. And even Ishvara, yeah, I mean, it's a sort of placeholder for any number of possible things. But
Yeah,
the idea is faith in the practice. And the thing that you're having faith in is as you say, the ability to connect to something that's actually beyond this mind and the body. Because the ultimate thing is to not be afraid of dying, because this body is absolutely going to fall to pieces. And all the things that
exactly.
we try to hold on to are going to disintegrate.
Right,
But yeah, there's still something to have faith in, which is a way of seeing that is not concerned about any of that, because it's
right.
just is. It's just
I mean, I think it's
it is.
revolutionary, because if you look how faith has been used in organized religion, it's been used to control people, because spiritual teachings are the most powerful of all. I mean, most revolutions are based on spiritual principles and ideas. I mean, if you look at them, it's the heart of humanity is spirituality, and yet and we have access to these yoga teachings that offer ways for individuals to do it by themselves, and that's revolutionary to me, is that you don't need the structure of church, or the priest or minister to do it for you. You actually can do it by yourself through yoga, and that's kind of what I've been trying to get at through my teachings, and especially this Yoga Revolution book. Actually, that's what I was trying to say, is it's revolutionary because we can do it ourselves. Like, we don't need that, and it would, I think, transform us and give us a lot of power, because I think in capitalism in general, and I mean, in the moment that we're in right now, the world is feeling chaotic and messy. I feel powerless, and yet I know through my yoga practice that's not true. That actually power lies with me, and each of us has that within us. And I think it's so important for us to recognize that it's not about giving people power; it's about giving them the recognition that they have that already, right? Agency within themselves. And I think that's how yoga could change the world, is if it was taught that way. But it's not being taught that way.
Well, everybody's getting lost on the body and
Yeah,
what it can and can't do.
exactly.
And it's very interesting. The very next word in that sutra that talks about the importance of faith is vidya, which is this
Mm,
power that comes out of the faith. And the faith is really just confidence. It's
yeah.
an absolute certainty that there is this power within us, because
Yeah.
it's something we can tap into, we can experience it. It's not an
Yeah.
idea. You don't have to believe in it. It's not
Right.
that kind of faith.
Yeah.
It's not blind faith. It's based on experience.
Right. And actually, I was thinking about too. He brings up Ishvara Pranidhana a couple of times, right? Like book 2, Sutra 1. He's saying yoga in practice or in action is that as well. Like you go through tapas, so you have suffering or discipline, and then you reflect on it and you think about it or something, and then the answer is faith, to have reconnect with yourself again. Like, it feels to me like he's saying yoga in practice is that process, this journey back to yourself.
Well,
Yeah.
that's true, but I think those three components are equal in a way. And the tapas is to do something that's a bit uncomfortable, which I guess is going to bring me back into, poking a little stick at the
Okay.
accessible yoga conception of things,
Yeah.
because sometimes it suggests to me that we're trying to get comfortable. And there was a line somewhere, I did make a note of it. Yeah, you said, I always want my students to be comfortable and to have a positive experience. Now, this was in the chapter where you're talking specifically about trauma-informed approaches, but
Mm.
I just wonder the extent to which, for tapas to be part of practice, isn't that about getting out of the comfort zone and being okay with things not being positive?
Mm. I see that, but I think in the context of the role of a yoga teacher, I don't think it's our job to probe and poke and trigger people. Sometimes it's done, yoga teachers think that's their job. And I think we have to be cautious. We're not trained therapists. I think we have to understand literally our scope of practice, like what it is that we're doing. And so my job isn't to push you outside of your boundary, it's to offer you practices for you to explore yourself. I agree that growth, for growth to happen, there has to be some discomfort. Yeah.
Mm.
But I actually think growth can happen. What I've seen my students do, the ones who've really grown, or when they feel held by me, like you said earlier. What was it? The arms of the mother. I think that
It sustains a yogi like a loving mother. This is
like a loving mother. I mean,
Harinanda's
I kind of
translation.
see myself as that. And I try not to say it publicly like I just have. But I mean, when I'm teaching, I actually feel like I'm holding the students in my hands. And I think that support and love and kindness that I can offer them is the fertile ground for them to grow, actually, rather than the disciplined, I mean, because I actually in the book, I do talk about how some yoga classes feel like performance. Like it's like you need to do what I'm doing. You should wear the clothes I'm wearing, and you should look like me, and you should do the things I do. Right? There's a very performative aspect of modern asana classes, and I don't think that, to me, that doesn't support the kind of internal growth that we're talking about, which I actually think happens when we feel supported. It reminds me of like restorative yoga. When I studied with, like, I actually go to yoga therapy. I have a yoga therapist, Sherry Clampus. She's a really well-known teacher. She actually lives here in town. She's incredible. And what she does for me when I go and have sessions with her is she just creates comfort and support for me. And then she asks questions and she'll maybe touch one thing. It's a very, it's a kind of wisdom that maybe I couldn't get that far in that book, but it starts with the support.
No, I hear you. And it's a very important sort of illustration of the paradox that is often there
Yeah.
in yoga, that it's both and it's not
Mm.
either or. Um, but yeah, it's definitely not the job of the yoga teacher to slap people out of their comfort zone. There's been far too
Exactly.
much of that. But it's also at the same time important, I think, to remind people that it's okay to feel uncomfortable sometimes. Otherwise we're ever more trying to secure the space as the safest it can be, whereas there's almost no insurance against that, especially when it comes to the end of the whole thing at death.
Yeah.
The body is going to decay, and
Yes.
the whole thing is to start
Well,
to face
I
that.
share in the book a story of when I was first, in the first few years of my teaching, I taught at a public hospital in San Francisco, and I
Mm.
didn't know what to expect. And I walked in, and there were 5 students who were all had quadriplegia. They couldn't move their bodies. 2 of them could move their heads slightly, and 2 of them could talk a little. The other 3 couldn't speak at all or move their bodies at all. And they just left me in the room with these 5 students, like teach them yoga. And it just was such an amazingly mind-blowing experience. Because it really challenged me to think about, what am I doing? I think I'm teaching spiritual practice, but I'm really just teaching body movement, exercise. And it took a long time for me to come to terms with that. I mean, I kind of tell a story in the book about it, but I think we have to let go of that. We have to understand the role of the body. It's very important, but it's just one step in that process. And the deeper we go, the more powerful it is. And what I actually learned from those students is that you can make something more accessible by going to a more subtle level, like the koshas, and how you could work on the energy level or with the mind. Visualizing practice it is simpler, it's easier, but also more advanced at the same time, right? Even though I hate that dichotomy, but you know what I mean? It's like something that's more accessible can also be more powerful, is what I learned.
I hear you. No, exactly. And I guess there's dichotomy lurking in there that I'm keen to tease out as well. And it does relate to the way we sort of try to verbalize all of this, but what we're pointing towards and how it goes. And, it's between sort of encouragement of others to explore what you're, really devoting your teaching towards, while at the same time, feeling that they do need a kick up the backside. And there's some quite strong, almost finger wagging language comes out at times, which I was struck by, particularly because you explicitly talked about your distaste for Iyengar yoga teaching in particular, which I've had my own experience of. I know it
Yeah.
inside out, of people, basically getting publicly shamed as a way of being taught asana. I just sort of wonder, how far to push that. And I'm thinking particularly, talking about sometimes cultural appropriation. You had some very strong language. You said, if you're only using the teachings for profit and approaching yoga teaching just as a job, you're appropriating an ancient indigenous practice that has already been and is still very much being colonized and abused by Westerners. And that's sort of it's quite a confronting way of putting things. It also suggests that you're not somehow complicit in that, which, as a Westerner, presumably you are.
I am. Yeah, I should have added that. I thought I did. I mean, I think it's part of my process, trying to share that is like, what am I doing? Yeah, maybe I should have been more thoughtful with that. I don't know. I think awareness of it is really important. And considering my position and what am I doing to further cultural appropriation or address it. Part of it for me is turning to voices of South Asian teachers, and not all the time, but really lifting them up and trying to show that that's also important. Because I think it's strange to me that if you look at the biggest teachers in yoga in the world, like who are the most famous yoga teachers, they're almost all white American teachers. And that seems odd. So I don't know. I tried to do that in the book. I tried to bring in a number of South Asian voices, in particular, and I do it in all my books. I try to highlight them as best I can. And in my teaching, in the school I always highlight them in terms of guest teachers and offering them a platform as best I can. So yeah, it's a challenge for sure, because I know that the appropriation conversation, yeah, it's complicated. I don't know if you want to go there. I mean,
I'm happy to. I found it
yeah,
fascinating, actually. Yeah, so please feel free.
I mean, I think it's just, I mean, I'm a queer person and I kind of feel like I'm also, a cisgender white man. And so I feel like, my queerness is giving me just a slight taste of maybe what it's like to be on the outside and have, a little bit of challenge in terms of marginalization. But then I have a lot of privilege as a
Mm.
white cisgender man. I have a lot of people that will listen to me and a lot of doors open for me that don't for other people. And so I don't know, just have an awareness of that and the way that race in particular, I think, is used, and racism is such a big part of our culture. So to me, cultural appropriation is, I think, has its roots in racism and colonization, and the way that, white people have colonized indigenous cultures around the world and then extracted what they want and used
Mm.
it, and then kind of left those communities with this sense of, I don't know, like I was reading something about Africa and how we always say that we think of Africa as a poor continent and that these countries in Africa don't have anything, but actually they're incredibly rich countries. The natural resources are incredibly abundant, but they're being extracted from the West. Where actually Western countries are using those, um, the resources, and not sharing them really with the local communities. And I feel that way about yoga somewhat. It's almost like how much benefit is going back to India in particular and to South Asian teachers, right? And how much money and resources are actually going just to white Americans, including myself. I mean, I'm definitely part of the problem. So maybe that's why the language is stronger, because it's something I'm struggling with.
Well, I don't know. I wonder maybe you could cut yourself a little bit more slack because
Uh,
there's, it's just the problem of being a person. I mean, those dynamics, obviously, historically, unignorable. They're part of the story of, how yoga ever came to the West because the British colonized India and, were in the business of stealing things and then using, Sanskrit texts to help them govern the local population, hence translating all these things in the first place. And slowly awareness spreads, and then teachers suggest to their students, bring your knowledge that you've picked up from me and spread it widely, and it's all fine. And so there's an encouragement to do that, and yet at the same time, there's plenty of exploitation of yoga teachings for profit and for all sorts of nefarious political objectives in modern India. So it's not necessarily a white
that's
person thing. It's,
that's true. Well, and
it,
casteism, I think, is another great example of that. I mean,
exactly.
casteism is a huge problem that hasn't been addressed in
And
yoga.
it's, a lot of the old texts are from a time that was riddled with that problem. The Bhagavad Gita is all about upholding the caste system in some way, as well as also being an opportunity for everyone to get liberated if they stay in their lane. So these things are messy, and I sometimes feel like in order, because we're for the most part in this sort of yoga teaching world, conscientious people concerned about doing harm, trying to think about what we can do better, that we can sometimes be seduced into sort of slightly overdoing our role in the problem rather than just seeing it as part of how things unfold, and that it's not exclusive to us. And also that the whole history of yoga is about cultural appropriation. The Bhagavad Gita, again, let's take that example, is basically Brahmins, borrowing all sorts of things that the Buddhists had really popularized to say, hang on, we can make that part of our system. Also stealing, the basic idea of yoga as something that rejects the whole Vedic ritual approach to life and saying, we'll put it all in the melting pot, reinvent everything. And what do you know? We stay top of the tree. So there's that in sort of embedded in the whole process of how yoga has evolved, ideas going backwards and forwards between traditions, unattributed, and kind of misrepresented sometimes just for the purpose of promoting a particular lineage. And I
Yeah.
guess what we've added into the mix is, as you say, profit, and there's resentment, understandably, particularly when people from India see things that they hold sacred completely,
Yeah.
rubbished effectively, and turned into trinkets that other people put a lot of cash in the bank from. So I understand that people are annoyed about it, but I sometimes think that the whole framework of the concept of cultural appropriation doesn't really explain what's wrong about those actions.
Yeah.
Those
I
actions are
think,
wrong because they're disrespectful and opportunistic and dishonest, effectively, as well.
yeah, I think you're right. I think it's oversimplified, perhaps, because there's a history of it within the yoga tradition for sure. And I think caste is where I just keep going back to. And I just think that's like the frontier of what needs to be studied now and discussed more in yoga is casteism and the impact it's had on the way we're teaching today. Um, I don't know if you know the book, The Trauma of Caste, Tenmori Soundararajan.
I don't
It's
know
such
that one. No.
it's such an amazing book, and she really addresses that, a Dalit feminist meditation on survivorship, healing, and abolition. Um, and I think it's just helped me understand that, yeah, this has been an ongoing issue in India, like you said, and through the history of yoga, because, for example, in the book, she talks about how so Dalit people, lower caste people, weren't allowed to read or hear Sanskrit at all, and so they were not allowed to be part, of that tradition. But there was also a history where, I think you said, like, where some of the rituals of the local people, like community rituals, were then used and made to be lifted up, and then were kind of extracted from the people themselves. So it's incredibly complicated. But I do think even today, caste is a part of what's happening in yoga, and like you said, it is still being politicized in India, obviously. I mean, through the through the way that politics is happening, International Day of Yoga and all that mess, which is really terrible. Hinduism has used it to kind of reclaim the yoga teachings for political purposes, which is really painful and unfortunate. So it's not simple, and I maybe I oversimplified, but I think it's just because maybe I'm not the person to talk about it. I probably should have said it in a more careful way, but
That's okay. And I didn't mean to sort of single you
That's
out there,
okay.
but it's just interesting. I think sometimes, in pursuit of justice, it's very tempting to fall for these ideas that there's the right answer and there's this the silver bullet, and if we all just fixed cultural appropriation, the world would be lovely. And firstly, I'm not
Yeah.
sure how we could do that, and
Yeah.
secondly, it's a problem of people wielding power over other people by nefarious means. It's not
Mm,
confined to white Western yoga teachers, unfortunately. In fact,
no.
to come back to the point you made about the biggest yoga teacher, I mean, in India, the biggest celebrity yoga teacher is Ramdev, the sort of sponsor of the current prime minister, who's got a multi-billion-dollar corporation that he named after Patanjali. So if that's
Yeah.
not cultural appropriation, I don't know what is.
Yeah, right. And doing a lot of harm, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of you know, danger to that. I mean, what's happening in India, I think there's a kind of erasure of like the Muslim community, and the attacks on that community is really terrible. Um, yeah, it is messy. But yeah, it's human nature, I think. But I feel like, I guess for me, it's like understanding where I fit in, and also an acknowledgement of my role in it, I think is very important, to place myself consciously um, within this stream of history, and just to be honest with myself and not pretend otherwise. So that's part of practice, right? This kind of self-inquiry, and also reflection on who am I and where am I in that whole mess of yoga. Yeah.
Hey, and you know, honestly, it's it stands to your credit that you're prepared to firstly write about your own potential shortcomings, but also to
Yeah.
discuss them. Um, and that does lead me on to the last question. Just briefly, I wanted to come back to another line that which I think may not even have been your wording. It was the headline on a Yoga Journal article where you were talking a little bit about politics a few years ago, and the headline on it was "Yoga has always been political," and that in fact I think annoyed a South Asian writer to the extent that they sort of demanded right of reply and wrote another article basically critiquing a white Western yoga teacher who thinks yoga should be social justice oriented, who's talking about caste and whatnot, and should get back in their box and stop telling Indians what to do. So it really is complicated. It makes me wonder, is there any particular political worldview that we could really base in yoga teachings, or
Well, I mean,
is
just to
that
mention, I think that particular teacher probably supported the current, you know, system in India, and
oh,
that giving
absolutely.
you perspective on the control. Yeah, so I think it's important to reflect on that. It's not that all Indian or South Asian voices have the truth either. We need to understand
Exactly.
more subtly, for sure. Yeah, I think that was a headline that Yoga Journal put on that piece. But I was trying to speak to, actually, I think it was when Yoga Revolution came out, possibly, and
Mm.
in that book, Yoga Revolution, I talked about the revolutionary nature of these teachings, which I touched on earlier a bit, which is that if we can recognize our inherent individual power, it can shift the way we are in the world and potentially have political implications. And part of that is to recognize that my understanding of yoga is that our spirit is the same, or at least different but the same, and that the human experience is completely different and diverse. And so it's almost like we need to be able to perceive that similarity of what's shared, and also the difference clearly, as we go into the world. And what I feel like is happening through mostly spiritual bypass is that we kind of think, oh, it's all good, everything's okay, rather than recognizing the real challenges that exist for many people. And so for me, politics is another word for how we interact with each other, the rules we make to govern our societies, and the way we treat each other. And I think that for a yoga practitioner, if we can find compassion for others by finding this connection, part of us that's connection, without denying the difference. So if someone's suffering because of racism, even though I'm white, I can recognize that suffering. I don't have to deny it, because it's not this, they're not the same as me. It's like, what I'm saying? Like there's a tendency to like deny it through yoga and through spiritual teachings. And I think that's been a mistake. I think that's spiritual bypass, rather than to acknowledge that you're the same as me, but you're having different experience and you're suffering because of this thing. And so my practice is to see our connection and have compassion for you through that. And that will shift the way that I treat you, and would therefore shift the way that I act politically, who I vote for, what I support, what I want my tax dollars to go to. I think that's a natural outcome of my being, not only being a spiritual practitioner, a yoga practitioner, but also being a householder practitioner, which is that the other thing that drives me crazy is that we pretend that we're these ascetic monastics, and it's just so not true. Like, it's just not what's happening at all. We're dealing with the world and with politics and money and business. And if we're going to be practitioners, I think we need to bring that perspective into all of those things that we do.
I hear you. And that will also therefore mean, given the diversity, that there'll be, multiplicity of political expressions based on that true understanding. But
Yeah.
at least if we can all be connected to that on some level, there's some hope that there might be slightly less domineering and exploitative expressions of our aspirations in the worldly sphere.
Yeah, but I think it's true that we'll have different political expressions, but I think that if you look at the teachings, it's clear that we'll have compassion. Compassion is the result of acknowledging who we are and seeing that in others. I mean, the Gita says it really clearly, that there's a section, it's in chapter 6, I believe, where Krishna is talking about that. Like, once you perceived your own spiritual nature, your own Purusha or Atman, then you will see it in others and actually feel the pain and pleasure of others as your own. And I think that, to me, is that recognition of our shared humanity. And I think that will shift the way that, I think that's what social justice is. I mean, social justice isn't necessarily like, I mean, it is identified as a kind of a left idea, but I think compassion is the key, right? Like, wanting everyone to have the same benefits that I do, right? Like, I want everyone to have housing and safety and food. And I don't know if that's political as much as it's just compassionate.
That's a really nice first to conclude on, I think. I think the 32nd shloka of the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is that one, seeing everybody's suffering as and pleasure as the same as your own. And as I suppose we've tried to express through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other such documents that people ignore far too often.
Exactly.
These are universal aspirations, universal values. And I guess what I was touching on is that sometimes political expressions can speak to particular shared interest groups and to sort of see the world in terms of one particular group's needs over and above those of another group, whereas in reality, in the end, unless we're talking universally, I don't think we are aligned with that underlying spirit of things, although obviously everybody is conditioned to think in terms of those sort of group priorities more than they are of the groups that they're not part of. But that's the messy business of being a human again.
I mean, I think you can see it in the US. I see it in religious fundamentalists who perceive themselves as religious and yet seem to have no feeling for other humans. There's like such a lack of compassion and care for, it's like there's a concern for an unborn fetus, but what about actually born children, right? Like, that makes no sense to me. It's illogical, right? Like, so I think that spirituality is so often abused in politics, and that's why that title was dangerous. I think you're correct to highlight that. But I do think what I was trying to say in that article is that we can find compassion for others through practice, and that will inspire us to act differently in the world and care for each other, because I think that's what politics could be. There can be politics that's used to give people what they need. I mean, to me, that's why bureaucracy should exist, is only to care for those that don't have what they need. but unfortunately, it's often just simply used by people who have power and money to get more. So my hope is that people who are spiritual practitioners and yoga practitioners, is that through their practice, they can start seeing through some of that, right? And that it will impact the way they act in the world. One last thought is just even in business, if you look at the way that yoga studios run, there's a lot of unethical business practices done within yoga. And that just makes no sense to me. If you're going to call yourself a yoga practitioner, then you have to apply these ethics in everything you do.
100% agree.
Okay.
Thank you, Jivana. That's been a great conversation. I really appreciate your willingness to step outside the comfort zone a little bit and explore those topics. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.